All right, let me get myself in focus here, and then we will get going. Hello, everybody out there in Atlanta. This is Chris from HHN.com with another exciting episode of Topher's Log. If you don't know what Topher's Log is, you can go back and you can watch the first two episodes of Topher's Log. It's a new series that I'm doing, basically a stripped-down version of My Talking Head, where I just sit around and speculate with everybody else about what may or may not be coming to the event, the progress of the events, what's happening, so on and so forth, leading up until Halloween Horror Nights 29, obviously. Gonna get right into it this week. There's a couple things I really kind of want to focus on, but first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about things that we do know concretely, and that is something that Mr. Aiello had posted on Twitter about where the event is status-wise. We've been told that they're currently starting or working on their 7th treatment for the event this year. Hollywood, I believe, is working on or started the 4th treatment for their event. House treatments, of course. Treatment is not a clue. It's not a code word. It's not one of those things. It's a term that is used out, in the entertainment field that deals with, these in terms of film. It is literally the story of what the film is going to be. That is literally what a treatment is. You write out the story, in a maybe like a 5 or 6 page treatment, and then somebody, maybe the guy who wrote the treatment or somebody else, is hired to actually physically write the screenplay for said film, and that's literally all it is. It's not a clue. It's not one of those things. There's been a lot of talk as well. Orlando has 7. You're about to do 7. Hollywood has 4. That kind of makes sense to me because Orlando has original properties as well. Hollywood generally does not. So it makes kind of sense that Orlando would be maybe 1 or 2 houses ahead of schedule because they may or may not be working on their original content, because that's just how Orlando rolls. So we know that for a fact. So that is a thing that is currently happening concretely that we know. This episode is going to be a little bit difficult for me because I've said it in the past. I may or may not know some things that are coming to each event. And I don't like to spoil things. I don't like to, if I know or not know something, I don't like to spill the beans, as it were. But if I'm going to do this series properly, I have to talk about what people are talking about. Talk about what people are talking about. Put that on a poster. But this week has been kind of slow in terms of chatter and things that I really found interesting and something that I want to talk about. So people love, of course, talking about the nitty-gritty of the event itself, and that's the houses. Specifically when it comes to one property. Now, this property that we're going to talk about wasn't really talked about this week, but it was in the conversation for the last couple weeks. It just kind of faded out a little bit. Full disclosure, last year, towards the end of the event, I may or may not have heard that this property was being talked about, was what I call, it was on the table for this year. And what that means to me when I'm told stuff like that is, okay, well, they're maybe talking to rights holders, maybe talking to companies that put out the property, trying to gauge the waters to see if they can land said property for the event. This one for me is interesting in a couple different ways. And that is Hellraiser. I know that Hellraiser is a property that a lot of the fans, especially fans of Hellraiser themselves, but fans of Horror Nights and fans of Hellraiser, have wanted to come to the event for a long time. And as we move through here, and Horror Nights sort of mines all these IP properties, you kind of have to, I don't want to say start stretching to pull from things, but you're kind of, especially with them being hand-tied with Warner Brothers and their thing, and Fox going to Disney and stuff like that, they have to sort of find other things that they can do. So in terms of Hellraiser, I think if and when Hellraiser comes to the event, it's kind of a good time for it because there's not a whole lot of other stuff in terms of name brand, name recognition. Hellraiser might not be one of the the more, I don't want to say popular because it is popular, but in terms of the general public, Hellraiser, they might know what Pinhead looks like. It's almost like a trick or treat situation. You might know what Sam looks like, but they might not have seen the actual film itself. It's one of those last big names in a way, for them to sort of get and bring to the event. Me personally, I am not the biggest Hellraiser fan. I've never really enjoyed the films. I just don't like the property or its 9,000 sequels. This is one of those horror properties that you like. They have how many sequels? How many of these did they make? Almost like the Leprechaun series. It was like, there's how many? They made how many Leprechauns, and they've rebooted how many? Hellraiser doesn't have a reboot yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the near future somebody reboots Hellraiser. But it's still chugging along. I think they just had a sequel. Was it 2 years ago, a year and a half ago? But yeah, so I'm not a fan of this property. So if and when this property does come to the event, it's not something that I would get excited about. I also think that there's a problem here in terms of literally translating something like Hellraiser to a house. When The Exorcist was brought, and even to a lesser extent, something like The Shining. When those were brought to the event, there was a lot of, especially with The Exorcist, like how do you do The Exorcist? Because for all intents and purposes, I know it's more than one location, but the horror of The Exorcist basically takes place in one location. And a lot of it is sort of psychological in a way. Like how do you do that? Like how do you represent that in a house, in a physical environment? How do you do that? Hellraiser, for me, there's a lot of layers to the Hellraiser stuff. It's because it's Clive Barker. There's a lot of dissecting of what's going on in terms of this overall story. You can do stuff that's on the surface, the horror stuff that's on the surface or whatever. But in order to translate something like this, for me, you would have to sort of peel away all that subtext, all that. All the questions, these existential questions that are being asked, and these existential crises that are happening inside the Hellraiser movies. There's just so many layers in there, and I think that if you took Hellraiser and made it into a house, you would lose all that because you can't really do that. You would have to just, here's Pinhead. It's basically what a Hellraiser house is going to look like. You can't really do too much around that. And I, even though I'm not a big fan of the property, I just don't know if that would really do this property justice. And for the fans, the people that have wanted to see this property come to the event, I'm not so sure that's enough for them, in terms of, because this is very different than something like a Freddy and Jason. It's very different than something like a Michael Myers. Like I said, there's a lot of layers involved in Hellraiser, and I just don't know. I don't know. I can't bring my brain to be like, how is this going to work? How would you pull this off? It's obviously a name brand. It's going to bring, like I said, people might not know. They might not have seen the movie, but they know who Pinhead is. So you can plaster Pinhead everywhere, and people are like, oh, I know him, that guy, the guy with nails in his face, So they've got that going for them, if and when Hellraiser does come to the event. But yeah, so that was I wanted to sort of talk about houses because I know that the houses are the bread and butter of the event. But it's just sometimes it's hard for me if I may or may not know something. So really try to hug a line here. But in terms of Hellraiser itself, I just don't know how they would be able to do something justice with this. It is what it is. But what do you guys think? Do you guys, do you think Hellraiser's coming? Do you want it to come to the event? Do you think it's time? Because it does follow that sort of pattern they've set out the last couple years. Classic 80s property, classic horror property, that type of thing. It does fit that pattern. If they were going to do it, like I said, they're kind of running out of those IPs. So maybe, you mine that finally. This could be a good year to physically take that off the shelf and do it. So that's it for me for this week. I will return next week. Who knows what we'll talk about? I will see you guys next time.